The member from Northumberland-Quinte West.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it's a pleasure, as always, to stand here in the chamber and discuss something as important as house rental and the effects that has on everyone throughout the province of Ontario, Mr. Speaker. You know, this is something that my esteemed colleague from Lambton-Kent Middlesex alluded to, and that's the fact that what we're seeing from the government side of the House, Mr. Speaker, is introducing bills that actually sound good, that actually appeal. They have very nice flowery wording to them. Makes you really feel really good inside, and that they're actually doing something. But the real tragedy here, Mr. Speaker, is the simple fact that this bill doesn't really address what Ontario really needs, which is jobs. We need jobs in Ontario. This government is doing very little to create those jobs. We've also come across a debt crisis. We're seeing the provincial deficit this year grow exponentially, and within the next 5 years, Mr. Speaker, up to $30 billion in the deficit. This is going to have an adverse effect on the services that we as a government provide to Ontarians and how we can deliver those services in a timely, efficient, and well-meaning manner, Mr. Speaker. So this bill, I have certain issues with. You know, as the member from Trinity Spadina alluded to, and as did my esteemed colleague from Lambton-Kent Middlesex, people are struggling here in the province of Ontario. They're losing their jobs. They're trying to find jobs. Housing, obviously, is something that is a necessity. It's important to have a building around you with a roof that you can actually grow as a family, as a community with. This bill does not actually help the residents of the province of Ontario, Mr. Speaker. And this is where I'm concerned, because as you well know, young people, the future of this province, who are not living in housing, who don't have that opportunity, Mr. Speaker, are finding it very difficult. And, Mr. Speaker, as the member from Durham also alluded to, my esteemed colleague, this bill is being held up, not held up by us, Mr. Speaker, but held up by the government, who is non-compliant to the simple fact that we are calling for a select committee because of Orange. The Minister of Health, obstruction, thank you very much, Mr. Whip, obstruction. The Health Minister herself, Mr. Speaker, stood up in this chamber and said that she would comply to the will of the Legislature. Our colleague friends to the left here and ourselves, the PC caucus, voted unanimously to form a select committee, Mr. Speaker. That's how democracy works. The will of the people. We are the voice of our residents, our constituents. Until the government realizes and respects that will, Mr. Speaker, we are going to continue to ring bells. We are going to continue to obstruct any further legislation that comes forward. Because, Mr. Speaker, that's all we have. The will of the people is not being adhered to. So, Mr. Speaker, we're fighting on behalf of our residents, our constituents, who want to see progressive movement forward in job creation and a strategy to fight our deficit, which is going to reach $30 billion, Mr. Speaker. We don't have to worry about the flowery legislation like Bill 19 and rent increases when there's going to be nobody who can afford to rent or own property, Mr. Speaker, because this government is basically destroying the backbone of what Ontario is, what it was, Mr. Speaker. the great engine of Confederation, the economic engine, Mr. Speaker, which our forefathers and mothers worked very hard to make a legacy, a future for younger generations coming up, the young people. You know, Mr. Speaker, as a former educator myself, history and English were the areas that I taught, Mr. Speaker, and as a historian, we have to look at the past in order to map out our future. We cannot forget the people, the individuals who came before us, who laid the foundation of this great province, Mr. Speaker, who had a vision of what Ontario could be, what Ontario can be, but what we're not currently. So, Mr. Speaker, this Bill 19, although it deals vaguely with the housing issue, as I alluded to earlier, there is going to be more and more individuals who are going to find it difficult, without a job, to live in a home, find a rental property. You know, when I was campaigning, Mr. Speaker, and the member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex alluded to this as well. You know, when I was campaigning, Mr. Speaker, one of the things I heard very, very often at the door was the exuberant price of electricity, the skyrocketing price of utilities, and how they were struggling, Mr. Speaker, to make ends meet at the end of the month. More and more, it became difficult. People had to choose, Mr. Speaker. There was an elderly couple in the town of Brighton. You know, and it saddened me greatly because here's a couple who actually the wife's father built the home in which they resided, in which, when they got married, grew their family, their children grew up in that residence, Mr. Speaker. And as I sat at their kitchen table, Mr. Speaker, I felt sorry for the husband and wife, who almost broke down into tears, Mr. Speaker, because they had to choose between selling their home because they couldn't afford it on a fixed income, because their property taxes are too high and their utilities were too high. So they figured the savings that they had was being eroded under this current government and their policies, Mr. Speaker. It was a sad day for me, but I realized, Mr. Speaker, that I was therefore getting involved on their behalf. I was going to be a strong voice at Queen's Park, Mr. Speaker, that day. I realized, you know, these could be my parents. They don't have a big splashy pension. They don't have a large bank reserve. How are they going to make ends meet? So, Mr. Speaker, this bill, I have to say, is nothing more than window dressing. People are struggling, Mr. Speaker, and if this government insists on supporting and propping up scandals like e-health, like Orange, and lining the wallets of their friends and inner circle.
I would ask the member to stick to the script. You're wandering a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I just have to say that, you know, when the government House leader says that, you know, we don't want to work, we're not willing to work on behalf of Ontarians, just the opposite, Mr. Speaker. We're here to work for them. We're here, we're the strong voice for our constituents who don't have a voice, Mr. Speaker. And for that elderly couple in Brighton, I'm proud to say that I'm here to obstruct what this government's doing to them. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And you know, as the government pointed out, they want things to move along. But really, again, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, you know, it's all talk. It's background noise, if you will. It's not really addressing what the heart of the matter is and what we're doing. You know, to my NDP colleagues, the members from Davenport and Trinity Spadina, you know, everything's rosy over there for the NDP. God bless. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that if people had jobs, they can afford rent. They can afford. So, Mr. Speaker, this government has done nothing to create jobs and address the deficit that we're facing. It's a crisis, Mr. Speaker. So, therefore, Mr. Speaker, we want to introduce legislation that's going to create jobs here in Ontario. We're going to implement legislation, Mr. Speaker, that's going to address the debt crisis that we're facing, to get Ontario back on its feet so that people will be able to afford housing, as my NDP colleague really wants to, you know? So, but it's our approach, Mr. Speaker. Only the PC caucus has the correct approach on how to get Ontario back to do that. Tim Hudak has laid out the foundation of how we are going to move forward.
Member from Trinity Spadina.
So, Mr. Speaker, you know, Bill 19, although it talks about rental housing and how it's going to improve the lives of individuals, as I alluded to, it does nothing, Mr. Speaker. Only Tim Hudak and the PC caucus have that plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Further